Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know here on the internet that brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. We've been doing that for 33 years now. My co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel, was with us here in the beginning back in 1989, writing excellent articles on monetary policy and other aspects of libertarianism. Richard, good to see you again for another round.
It's good to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, if you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily. It'll keep you apprised of all the things we're doing. And we really consider it the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We got a monthly journal, Future of Freedom. But Richard, we're right back to deja vu again with respect to the debt ceiling. So, we've addressed this several times over the years because it keeps coming up. But I thought, well, now's the time to address this issue once again, because the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has said that on June 1st, they're not going to be able to pay their bills anymore, that they're finally going to run out of money. And so, time will tell whether that's true or not. But I thought, well, this would be a good time to revisit this issue. And I imagine we might have to revisit it again if there's no deal struck to raise the ceiling again. But, I'm not saying I'm any Nostradamus or anything, but I predict that a deal will be struck to raise the debt ceiling again. And why do I say that? I've predicted this, as you'll recall over the years. I've predicted the same thing every time the debt ceiling is reached. And my prediction is proven correct. My prediction has always been that the debt ceiling is going to be raised. So I want to put these predictions in a historical context just to start out our discussion. That when we first started discussing this, I explained, and I'll explain right now, that when Congress passes a debt ceiling, what they're really saying is that too much debt is a bad thing for a government. It's a very dangerous thing. And that's what they're saying. They're saying here, this is the maximum amount of debt that the federal government is going to be able to incur. And the reason they put that maximum amount is because if the federal government goes beyond that, is getting into very dicey, very dangerous area. So when the debt ceiling is reached, what's the response of everybody? Well, everybody goes ballistic. The mainstream press starts going ballistic, and that, oh my gosh, we have to raise it again. Well, if you raise it, then it really isn't much of a ceiling then. A ceiling is a ceiling. It's the maximum. But they're saying, no, we've got to raise the debt ceiling because the expenditures are exceeding the income. So we need to be able to borrow more money. But when you ask them, well, what about the spending problem, though? They'll say, oh, well, that can be handled after the debt ceiling is raised. That then spending can be reduced after that. But what always happens, and this has always been my prediction, that as soon as the debt ceiling is reached, the mainstream press, which has put on all this pressure that, oh, there's going to be a default and the sky's going to fall in and all this, they go back to just business as usual. First they uncork the champagne bottles and they celebrate, we pulled off another debt ceiling increase. But at no time from that point to the point when the debt ceiling is reached again, do they ever say, we really need to slash federal spending here to prepare for this new ceiling that's been set that's going to come in 2 or 3 years from now. They just totally forget about it until the new debt ceiling is starting to be reached. And all of a sudden it all starts over again. And my prediction each time is, the mainstream press is going to be able to put this pressure on. Congress is going to relent. Executive branch is going to relent. They're going to raise it again. And sure enough, my prediction is proven true every bit of the way. My position is, Richard, the only way that you can balance expenditures with expenses is to enforce this debt ceiling and just flat out say that this is all there is. And that would, of course, cause the government to start laying off people, maybe abolishing programs, which would be the ideal, but they couldn't borrow anymore. They'd have to have expenditures equal income. And that obviously it's not the ideal. The ideal is dismantle a whole welfare warfare state. But in fiscal policy, in terms of the debt ceiling, it's the ideal. And yet, my prediction is, once again, they're going to strike a deal that's going to raise the debt ceiling again. What do you think?
Okay, well, I've become the boring numbers guy recently, and I'm going to do it again. I've written some numbers on the back of an envelope.
Oh, wait a minute.
I
Wait,
know
wait,
because
Richard. Richard, I'm falling asleep already.
in the real world, numbers tend not to lie if they've been collected accurately. Now, I know that the woker people say that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. That they say to suggest that is white racism, so that women and people of color can be arithmetic oppressed. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that 2 + 2 = 4. Go figure. Okay, so every month, the Congressional Budget Office issues a monthly budget report. How much has the government spent? How much has the government taken in revenues? What the sources of those revenues have been during the month, and what have been the sources of the outlays, the expenditures during the month. And then the latest report was issued in April, and it covers through March. Now, again, I've mentioned this before, but to remind our listeners, the US government does not operate on a calendar year budget. It has a fiscal year which begins on October 1 and runs until September 30th. So the current 2023 government fiscal year began on October 1, and it will run until September 30th of this year. So October through March was the first 6 months of the current federal government fiscal year. And they had all these numbers. And I'm going to bore everybody, but numbers are important in terms of the hysteria that has been presented lately. I'll let what you were saying, Jacob. Fair enough? Okay. During the last 6 months, the government spent approximately $3.15 trillion. Their total revenues were about $2.050 trillion. So a little over $1 trillion in revenue, about $3.1 trillion in expenses. That works out to about $525 billion per month, right? That number divided by 6. And total revenues were about $340 billion. Now, you say, but look here, $552 billion in expenses, only $340 billion of revenues. Oh, that's okay. Hold on for a minute. Out of those total expenditures, because this is what they usually talk about, what have been in the entitlement expenses, right? The mandatory, so the little ladies on retirement get their Social Security, the people who need to go to the hospital get their Medicare and Medicaid, and let's not forget the interest to our federal government bondholders. Oh, we can't default. Okay. This is the bottom line. Entitlement spending during the last 6 months averaged approximately $230 billion a month. Net interest on the national debt came out to about $52 billion, but I'm going to say $60 billion. So that means that out of total revenues of $340 billion on average per month, we have expenditures, that is the federal government does for entitlements and interest on the debt, of $300 billion. That means that the government's revenues are bringing in more than enough to pay all the entitlement, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the net interest to the bondholders. We do not have to default. The revenues are there. So that leaves approximately $40 billion of net revenues after you discount entitlements and interest on the debt. So that means if you do the arithmetic, that leaves, let's say for the month of June, right? Because this is when Yellen says we will not have enough money to pay everything. We will pay the entitlement programs. We will pay the interest on the debt. And then after we subtract the amount of revenues left over, we would have a net deficit, that is of government spending in the month of June, of approximately, rounding over, $185 billion. Now, it is surely possible for all the other departments in the US government, Defense, State Department, the CIA, the National Security Agency, Education, Agriculture, Commerce, housing and urban development, blah, 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 blah. To divide up $185 billion among them and just shave off a little bit of what they're currently spending. Oh, we can't carry out a contract. Oh, we can't have as many paper clips. Oh, we're going to cut back on bureaucrats' travel, flying coach or business class. Oh, how terrible. Okay, there is no budgetary crisis in the sense that these people are saying, we have the money not to default on our bondholders, both domestic and foreign. We have enough money to pay all the entitlement programs. And again, this isn't a matter of the philosophical principle. Should the government be? We're talking about the practical matters that we hear out of Washington, D.C. We have enough revenues on average each month to meet the average entitlement costs and the interest on the debt. This is all hysteria. What they would have to do is that meeting all of those, quote, essential obligations, they would have to find a way to cut $185 billion from everything else the government does. Because if you do, then as you were just saying, the budget is balanced. This is absolute nonsense. It's political hype. So all those in Washington, all those who make these political decisions do not have to tell the voters that some programs have to be cut, that are basically under the category of discretionary spending. Because by saying it's the little old ladies not getting Social Security, it's a foreign bondholder not getting his interest payment, and the financial markets of the world will collapse, they scare everybody in thinking that every dollar the government spends has to be viewed as sacrosanct, and that therefore the expenditures determine the amount of revenues. And if we can't tax it, then we have to raise the debt ceiling to keep borrowing and borrowing. This is political lies. Because in the world in which 2 + 2 = 4, sorry, woke people, this is not the crisis that they say. Yes, we spend more than we take in. The government has to trim its sails to balance its budget, which would occur if the debt ceiling is not raised. But this is not the financial and fiscal crisis that they present to us, because this is all part of a political agenda of always rationalizing the spending without having to tell people what it really costs by just borrowing more and kicking that can down further down the road.
Well, are you saying that it's 185 billion they have to cut each month?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that's the problem, is that, that's all that $185 billion is somebody's income.
Correct.
Somebody's benefiting from that. And
bureaucrats,
yeah,
some contractor, a defense contractor, military pay, Boeing for building airplanes for the Air Force, blah, 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 blah. You are absolutely right. It's the people who, if the bureaucrats don't get their full salary and the bureaucrats can't go out for their 2-martini lunch in Washington, D.C., the local restaurant loses business.
that's right. Well, let me give you an example of this, especially with respect to the military. I mean, we've got this gigantic military intelligence establishment. It's just an absolute disaster. But I read an article that there was a base in, I think it was Arizona, that centered around the A-10 plane, and which they're doing away with. So they don't have any need for this base at all. It'd be so easy just to close it.
Right.
Well, the people in that community just went ape. Oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to survive. This is going to be terrible. Oh, in other words, they're on the dole. They're on the military dole. So the military crafted a solution to keep that base open, to satisfy these people that are on the dole, this community. Well, if they can't even close a base that they acknowledge is no longer necessary, imagine how difficult it's going to be for these people to cut $185 billion a month, because everybody that's on the receiving end of that dole, welfare dole, warfare dole, is going to fight viciously. And he's going to come up with all kinds of reasons as to why his dole shouldn't be cut.
Yes.
But that's why I keep saying is that to enforce the debt ceiling is the greatest thing they could do, because it would force them to do this. I don't think you can expect these people to do it voluntarily. I mean, you can see this impasse that they've got. That if people would just stand fast and say, look, we enacted this debt ceiling, we've already raised it umpteen times. It's a very bad thing. It's a very dangerous thing. Today, we're going to enforce this debt ceiling. then that would force all these people to be laid off, the so-called non-essential workers. Well, if they're non-essential, what are they there for? And then you could do massive closing of military bases. Richard, what do we need all these domestic military bases for? I just don't see what their purpose is except to house troops and weapons. That's all they do. They call them the Department of Defense. It's ridiculous. There's no nation state that can invade the United States. Look at Russia. They can't even conquer Ukraine. What, they're going to all of a sudden invade Western Europe and England and cross the Atlantic and take over America and teach Marxism in the public schools of America? China certainly doesn't have the military capability of crossing the Pacific Ocean. And these are the so-called two big adversaries or opponents. There is no danger that America has of being invaded by some nation state. None at all. We need all these military bases here like we need a hole in the head. If you just closed 98% of them, laid off all those soldiers, you'd have a gigantic surplus. And then we can start talking about the welfare state side of this thing too. I mean, I don't have any problems with prioritizing the debt as a priority thing, because it's a priority payment, because this is a contract. I think government should honor its contracts. But welfare state programs are not a contract. They're just welfare state programs. They can be repealed today and nobody can go sue for breach of contract. So your figures are very, very interesting. It's not, but they're all crying Chicken Little, as they always do. The sky's going to fall in, oh, worldwide catastrophe and so forth.
And I'll tell you, Jacob, the reason why I decided to do this little arithmetic with the Congressional Budget Office numbers is because last week there was an article in the Washington Post in which they said, well, it's not being talked about and it's all hush hush, because then it'll sort of give the Republicans ammunition to refuse to raise the debt limit. They said that the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, the various leading governmental departments and agencies, they've been working out a contingency plan of priorities. Priorities. Hello, what did I just say? Entitlements, the interest on the debt, priorities. What would get paid? What would get not paid in full if the debt limit isn't reached? They're already planning to do exactly what I said right here, but they don't want you to know that, because then they would have to tell you the truth. Certainly they have a contractual obligation to the bondholders. Okay, it's a fact. You might not like it, but under law, it's a contract. You lent money to somebody, lent you money, they expect the money back in international courts. And the fact is that they are already planning to do exactly what I said, but they don't want to admit it because it'll rock too many boats and upset too many people who are going to have to get a haircut from the remainder of the discretionary spending category, like you were saying. Because some of the viewers and listeners remember a TV show that ran for about 5-6 seasons a few years ago called Army Wives. It was set in South Carolina. It's an Army military base, and all the men are off on their tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's one of the Army wives, one of the Army soldiers' wives, Roxy, owns the local bar and restaurant, and all the military personnel, come in for a drink and a meal at her little restaurant diner. Well, what happens if you start cutting that back? Poor Roxy loses her revenues because the soldiers aren't coming in anymore. And that's the person who then complains to the local congressman or the state senator, who then goes back to Washington and says, and then in the name of national security, the defense of America, Roxy's diner has to be saved in nowhere, South Carolina.
Oh yeah, and if a congressman takes a principled stand and says, I want to